Hey guys, let's see if we can't knock out our very first lecture for Intro to Psychology or General Psychology. So this will be chapter one or lecture one, and I'm going to try not to make these recordings too long because I realize that our attention spans are only so long, but I'd like to for each chapter, at least provide you with a little bit of information or a little bit of additional insight from me. I know that you're perfectly capable of reading your textbook, and I absolutely expect you to do that, but it's always nice to have an extra amount of input from your instructor. So that's what this is for. So I'm going to try to hit some of the highlights. Of course, if you guys have questions along the way, please don't hesitate to contact me either via email, via phone, or if you're on campus, I'd love for you to stop by my office. It's in room 107. So chapter one is really a basic introduction to what I call the science of psychology. It's designed to give you some of the foundational principles of an introduction to psychology course. You'll notice if you look at the chapter in terms of its organization, it kind of starts by introducing you to some of the basic concepts of the discipline, some of the different types of psychologists, because I think that's something that's really useful. And then it transitions into some of the more modern or contemporary perspectives, and finally wraps up with a discussion of research methodology, which is basically all of the different ways that psychologists go about gathering their data. So let's start really basic. What is psychology? So when I think of the definition of psychology, I really think of three components or three key pieces of this definition. So first and foremost is the word scientific. Psychology is a scientific discipline. We use a scientific method to go about collecting our data and gathering our information. It is not a pseudoscience. There is a lot more to psychology than Dr. Phil, even though I'm sure many people like Dr. Phil. The word scientific is, however, very important in our understanding of psychology because it points to the science behind how we go about collecting our information. You'll also notice two other key components of the definition. So the other word is behavior. So psychologists are interested in behavior, both animal and human behavior. So behavior is overt, meaning we can see it with our eyes, right? And typically we want it to be overt and measurable, meaning that we can assign a number to the measurement of the behavior or actions that we are seeing. We are also interested in mental processes. These are the covert things, that is, the things that we can't see, the things that are going on inside of our head. So, mental processing, thinking, intelligence, memory, all of those things would represent some form of mental processing or cognition. You may have heard that word before. So, when you put all of that together, basically, you have a scientific discipline that's interested in behavior or actions, overt things, as well as mental processes or covert things. There are many different types of subfields of psychology, and these are just a sampling. I believe these are located in your textbook on page 6. So for my purposes, I'm not so interested in you memorizing each one of these, but I do think it's important to understand that there are many different subfields of psychology, and consequently, there are many different types of psychologists. So most people, when they hear the word psychologist or they hear that you're a psychologist, they assume that you are a clinical psychologist. But although that is probably the most popular subfield of psychology, there are many others. Okay, my specialization is actually industrial organizational psychology, and I'd love to chat with you about that anytime you'd like. But basically, it's workplace psychology, so it's very different. So we've got neuroscience, which of course interested or focused on the nervous system with special emphasis on the brain. Experimental psychologists, which are primarily researchers. Cognitive psychologists interested in thinking and processing of information. Developmental psychologists who are interested in how we grow and change and develop over the course of our lives. Health psychologists, clinical psychologists who are interested in the study of psychological disorders. Social psychologists are interested in, okay, what happens when people get together? How do our interactions change when we're in groups? Cross-cultural psychology, and many others. And so what we're going to do in chapter one is really introduce ourselves to the basics of psychology. And then you'll notice over the course of the rest of the course and in our textbook, each chapter really focuses on a different subfield. So in terms of work, there are lots and lots of psychologists in the U.S. It is among the most popular majors for undergraduate students. It is a field that is dominated by women. Most psychologists have some type of doctoral degree, either a PhD, which is what I have, that's a doctor of philosophy, or a PsyD, which is a doctor of psychology. Some also have master's degrees. And it is important to note that a psychologist and a psychiatrist are not the same, right? So a psychiatrist is someone who has attended medical school, which is why they are permitted to write prescriptions. Psychologists would represent, again, someone with a PhD primarily or PsyD, sometimes a master's degree, who specializes in some subfield of psychology. They are not medical doctors. So in the next section, we're going to look at a little bit of the history of psychology and hopefully gain a deeper understanding of how it might apply to our lives. I'm not going to bore you by reading that to you. So a little bit of history. So how did psychology get its start? Well, this guy, Wilhelm Wundt, German guy, so we're going to pronounce those with V's, started the very first psychology lab at Leipzig, Germany in the year 1879. So some people say, okay, why is that a big deal? Well, it's a big deal because literally by opening or starting that first psychology lab, Wundt transitioned psychology from a branch of philosophy, which is where we started, into a scientific discipline. So that event is literally considered to be the start of psychology as its own scientific discipline. So keep in mind that even nowadays, when you hear that people are conducting investigations in a laboratory setting, it really changes the way that you perceive that discipline and the way that you look at the science behind that discipline. Okay, so historical perspectives would include things like structuralism. You'll notice a root word of that is structure. So structuralists are interested in the basic structure of the mind. That was actually Wundt's theoretical perspective. Functionalism, those folks are interested in how the mind works. What does it do? How does it allow us to live, to learn, to work, to study psychology, to study nursing, etc.? And then also Gestalt psychology. So Gestalt psychology has this really famous phrase associated with it, which is the whole, WHOLE, is greater than the sum of its parts. And I want you to give some thought to that. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So for example, when I think of my car is made of a bunch of parts. But if I take my car apart and I put all those parts in a pile on the ground, what do I have? I have a big pile of parts. I don't have a car anymore, right? So it loses its meaning. Similarly, Dr. P's favorite cake, that's me by the way, is red velvet. So if you take the basic components of that red velvet cake, like flour and butter and sugar and cocoa powder and all those wonderful things, and you throw them in a bowl, what you have is a pile of ingredients. But what you don't have is a good cake that you can eat, right? So Gestaltism says that when we look at the mind, we gain a deeper understanding of it if we process it as a whole rather than trying to break it apart into its basic elements. So essentially, structuralism and Gestalt psychology almost work in direct opposition. So structuralists want to take everything and break it apart. Gestalt psychologists want to keep it whole. Okay. Back to these just for a second. Just want to unpack these just a little bit for you, particularly with the psychodynamic perspective. Some of the key tenets or key components associated with the psychodynamic perspective. Of course, Sigmund Freud is a founding father of that perspective, but it really emphasizes the unconscious mind, right? Unconscious mind. So some people actually question whether or not there is a such thing as the unconscious mind. You might, for example, go to sleep tonight and you wake up the next morning and you had a dream and it was really weird to you. And in the process of explaining that dream to a friend or to your significant other, they look at you a little crazy, like, oh my gosh, what was really going on? Well, Freud looked at dreams as a form of wish fulfillment. So he said that when you're asleep and you're dreaming, that's a safe arena to sometimes explore things that you wouldn't feel comfortable doing in your waking consciousness, right? So essentially, while you're dreaming, the unconscious mind is giving you some insight into what's what's really bothering you, for example, or things that you really want to do that you can't when you're awake. So again, psychodynamic perspective, that's Freud stuff. Emphasis on the unconscious mind, oftentimes emphasis on early childhood experiences. Freud was actually the first person to say that, hey, some things, bad things happen to us as children, and those experiences can follow us into our adulthood, even in ways that of which we're not sometimes aware. There's also lots of emphasis on conflict at the unconscious level. And again, we'll unpack these ideas later on in the course. There's actually quite a bit of discussion related to psychodynamic perspective. In terms of neuroscience, again, that one focuses on the nervous system with special emphasis on the brain. Pretty much all of chapter 2 is devoted to neuroscience, so we'll go through the nervous system, the different divisions of the nervous system. We'll also talk about neural communication, right? Those neurons form the basis of your nervous system, and we'll talk about neurotransmitters and their role in neural communication. And then we'll wrap up the chapter by talking about some basic brain structure and function. So the behavioral perspective is really about learning and how it takes place. In general, learning can take place in one of three ways. So there's classical conditioning, sometimes referred to as associative learning or Pavlovian conditioning, if you've heard of that guy Pavlov and his famous dog. It can also occur by operant conditioning, that is based on the work of B.F. Skinner and Thorndike as well. And then it can occur based on social learning or observational learning. So to summarize, behaviorism is focused on how people learn. So that can be classical conditioning, Pavlovian conditioning, and again, we'll unpack these in an entire chapter later in the course. Operant conditioning, which is learning based on reinforcements and punishments, right? So if you do something and you get a reward for doing it, you learn to do it again. If you do something and something unpleasant happens after you do it, you learn, I probably shouldn't do that again. And then observational learning, which is how a lot of children learn to do things that they shouldn't do, like say bad words or do dances that are inappropriate for their age, right? So they observe someone older doing it, and then they simply mimic that behavior, right? So that's just a little tidbit on behaviorism. Again, we've got a whole chapter devoted to that later. Cognition, we've got some information devoted to it later in the course as well. That one focuses on thinking and processing of information. So all the information we'll discuss later in the course related to memory and learning, intelligence, all those things represent forms of cognition. Lastly, the humanistic perspective, you'll notice the word human kind of hidden in there. It focuses on what I refer to as all the ways that we are wonderfully and uniquely human. So it looks at things like self-actualization, which is the idea that each of us is motivated and is constantly striving to maximize our unique potential as individuals. It emphasizes things like free choice or free will. And you may have heard of this guy, Abraham Maslow. He is very famous for his hierarchy of needs, and we'll address that later as well. So those are the 5 modern day perspectives. And just to clarify, these are the different theoretical perspectives that psychologists currently use. Those that we mentioned historically with relation to Wundt, those are considered historical perspectives. So those historical perspectives no longer exist in pure form. They've kind of gone away. We consider them history. Sometimes they inform modern day perspectives, but they don't exist in pure form anymore. So what we know about psychology is that pretty much it's everywhere, as you see me put all over my syllabus, and it helps us solve some really practical problems. In other words, it's something that we can use in our everyday lives. So you see psychology in your work with patients, you see psychology in your interactions with your family, you see psychology in your interactions sometimes with perfect strangers, you see psychology in your interactions with your colleagues here at the college, and so on and so on and so forth. The list of topics here is just an example of some practical problems that we might use psychology to help us solve. So I'm going to skip over that. And just really quickly, I want to dive into the scientific method. So now we're in the section of the chapter where we look at the ways in which psychology gathers its information. And as we mentioned, based on our basic definition of psychology, that it's a scientific study of behavior and mental processes. So again, we're going to use the scientific method to gather all of our data. And here listed, you just have basic steps of the scientific method. So first, we have a question, right? We're curious about something and we generate a list of questions of interest. Then based on that list of questions of interest, then we try to formulate some type of theory or hypothesis which might explain the phenomenon in question, right? Our hypothesis is just, I know when I was in school, everyone said, oh, it's just an educated guess. I like to tweak that definition just a little bit. I'd say that it should be a precise and predictable outcome of the study, right? Step three, design some type of research or carry out some type of research to answer the question. And then step four, just communicate the findings. In other words, what happened? What did you find out? So those are the basic steps of the scientific method. Okay. So in terms of psychological research, first, again, we're going to start by developing some type of theory, right? So I think it happens in X, Y, or Z manner, okay? And then the hypothesis is going to be your, again, precise prediction as to the outcome. The hypothesis should not ask a question. It should always make a statement. And then oftentimes we're going to have variables of interest as part of our study. And we need to operationally define those things. So in other words, we need to translate those variables into measurable procedures for our particular study. Okay, so let's say, for example, I am interested in determining if the consumption of alcohol impairs driving ability of college students, right? So I might develop a theory, I might have a theory that it probably does, okay? Then I'm going to formulate a hypothesis, and my hypothesis might say something like the consumption of alcohol will impair driving ability in college students. Okay. Operational definitions. Well, how am I going to define impairment? How am I going to measure driving ability? How am I going to define alcohol, right? So their alcohol could be any number of things, right? How am I going to measure their driving ability? I would probably need to operationally define that, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so generally speaking, some psychological research is what we call descriptive, right? Literally, it's just going to describe a phenomenon in question. We're not going to interfere with anything. We're not controlling any variables. We're not manipulating any variables. Okay, so sometimes when you're looking at psychological studies, it might be based on archival research. So basically, that just means that there is an existing database, and then a psychologist or researcher just goes into that database and statistically manipulates it to see if there are any observations that can be made. Okay, we can also conduct what's referred to as a naturalistic observation. This is where we're just simply going to watch someone or something in their natural environment. Could be a human participant, could be an animal participant. So let's say, for example, I'm interested in the dating behavior of adolescents. A great place to conduct a naturalistic observation might be someplace like a movie theater or a shopping mall, right? I probably am not going to go to a five-star restaurant in Uptown Charlotte to conduct a naturalistic observation of adolescents dating, because there are probably not a whole lot of adolescents who are going to five-star restaurants for dates, okay? It's important with the naturalistic observation that we do not intervene. So essentially, we want to be able to observe what's going on in this natural environment, but we don't want to contaminate that environment by intervening in any way, shape, or form. What's a little tricky about naturalistic observation is that sometimes the researcher's presence is actually its own contaminant, right? So even though we try not to intervene, we try not to interrupt any behavior, sometimes our actual presence represents some form of intervention, even though we don't mean it to. Survey research. This is just where we're going to ask a group of participants a predetermined set of questions. Surveys are great in the sense that they are cheap and they are easy to develop, and you can get a whole lot of information relatively quickly. which is probably why they're so common. So if you've gone to a fast food restaurant and the person who took your order invited you to complete some form of survey in exchange for a chance to win a prize or in exchange for a free sandwich of some sort, then you have participated in some form of survey research. Surveys are also great in the sense that they allow us to sometimes get at covert behavior. So, in other words, with the naturalistic observation, for example, you're observing this behavior in its natural environment. So, you have to rely on the overt, right? The things that you can see with your naked eye. With the survey, it's again, you're not intervening in any way, but what you can do is you can ask that participant about things that are going on inside of their head. So you can ask them how they feel, for example. Potentially, surveys can be challenging in terms of the quality of data we get out of them because we're relying on self-report data, which means that we're relying on our participants to be honest in terms of their feedback. And as you might imagine, sometimes that does not happen. In other cases, there are issues with the questions themselves. Sometimes they're poorly worded. If you've ever taken a survey, at least I know I have, and sometimes you look at the options that are presented before you and you think, I don't really think it's any of these, but I guess this one's close enough, and then you just choose an answer, right? So we have to be really careful in the development of our questions for surveys. Case studies are great in the sense that they give us a massive amount of information on an individual or a small group. Typically, we choose a case study participant based on them having some form of salient or unique quality, right? So I always joke and say, I would make a horrible case study because my life is pretty boring, right? It's pretty normal, right? I live in the suburbs, I have a dog. There's not a whole lot that's exciting going on with me, but someone like Jeffrey Dahmer would have made a great case study. Michael Jackson would have made a great case study. You see case studies which feature serial killers a lot. Why? Because they have unique or salient qualities. There's something weird. There's something out of the norm. There's something unusual. So case studies it will give you a lot of information about that unique phenomenon or that unique individual. But unfortunately, here's a con associated with a case study. A lot of times you can't generalize that data. So one thing that I haven't mentioned up until this point is that the goal of all of our research is to be able to generalize our findings. So basically, we want to take what we learn and we want to be able to apply it to the general population so that we can help people. Well, if you're conducting a case study and you have a lot of information about someone who's unique or someone who's experienced something really rare, it's hard to generalize that, right? Because it doesn't apply to a whole lot of people. So hopefully at this point you're starting to get the picture that, okay, each one of these different research methods has pros and they have cons, and none of them is perfect. And really it's up to the researcher to decide which one is going to be best depending on their circumstances. How much time do they have? What's their budget? What are their research questions? Okay. Correlational research is also very, very popular. Correlational research looks at the relationship between two variables. It is very, very, very important that we remind ourselves that correlation does not show causation. In other words, just because two things are related does not mean that one causes the other to happen. So most of the research that you hear about in popular media is based on correlational research. So for example, we know that there are things that a woman who is pregnant should not be exposed to because they represent a danger to her unborn child. All of that research is based on correlational data. Why? Because it's unethical to intentionally, experimentally manipulate a variable that you think is going to cause harm to a person. So it would be unethical, for example, to say, oh, let's just find ourselves a sample of pregnant women and let's give them alcohol and let's see how much alcohol it takes before the child has birth defects. You can't do that, right? So again, much of that is based on correlational research. So when we look at correlational research, it is going to statistically measure, again, the relationship between two variables. That numerical measure will be referred to as a correlation coefficient, and it's just a number. That number will range somewhere between -1 and a +1. And depending on whether it's negative or positive, it gives us this different information. So, for example, if that correlation is a positive number, it means that those variables change in the same direction. So as one goes up, so does the other. Or as one goes down, so does the other. So, for example, there is a positive correlation between the amount of time spent studying for your psychology exam and your grade on your psychology exam, right? So, more time spent studying means you'll probably get a better grade. You'll notice the reverse is also true. Less time spent studying will probably mean that you will get a lower grade on your psychology exam. So that would be a positive correlation. A negative correlation means that those two variables change in opposite directions. So, for example, there is a negative correlation between cocaine ingestion and number of hours of sleep. And actually, yes, that's an example I got out of a textbook. So as the amount of cocaine a person ingests goes up, the number of hours that they sleep will go down, right? They go in opposite directions. Why? Because cocaine is a stimulant. So we'll talk about that later. Moving on to the experiment, right? So the experiment is what I refer to is as the big daddy of all the research methods. Why? Because this is finally the research method that allows us to determine cause and effect relationships. And that is very, very special because up until this point, we haven't been able to do that. Why have we not been able to do that? Because up until this point, we were not controlling or manipulating any variables, right? So when we conduct an experiment, we are going to deliberately produce a change in one variable and then observe the effects of that change. If there are any effects, sometimes you manipulate a variable and you don't get the results you thought you were going to get. So when we look at our experimental research, we will have two groups and we'll have two variables. So I'm going to go back to the first example I used where I hypothesized that alcohol would impair driving ability, right? So let's say I take a group of students. Let's say I've got a group A and a group B and a group C. Group A gets 5 shots of tequila. That's a lot of tequila. Group B gets 10 shots of tequila. Oh my gosh, that's a lot of tequila. And group C is going to get 5 shots of a non-alcoholic tequila flavored and colored liquid in a shot glass. Okay. So the experimental group would include any participants who receive my manipulations of the independent variable. Okay. So in this example, my independent variable, the variable that I'm deliberately manipulating or changing, is the amount of alcohol. Okay. The dependent variable is the variable that is the outcome. It represents the result. So I'm manipulating the amount of alcohol that my participants receive, and I'm measuring the effects on driving ability, right? So again, my independent variable is the amount of alcohol or the tequila. The dependent variable is the driving ability, and I'm going to operationally define my driving ability as the number of cones that they hit on a simulated driving course. Okay, so I've got my IV and my DV, independent and dependent variables. Okay, again, the experimental group would include any of my participants who receive my manipulations of the independent variable. So that would include groups A and group B because they both got real tequila. You will also recall that I had a group C who received a non-alcoholic substance in a shot glass. So they represent my control group, right? So the control group is essentially the comparison group. They would include any participants who did not receive my manipulations of the independent variable. Okay, so this is just an example from your textbook. I like mine better, but I could be partial. Okay. So the last section of this chapter just looks at ethics in research. And I'm going to just mention this quickly because most of Most of you will not be psychology majors, but I think it's important to mention at least briefly. So there's some basic ethical guidelines that all psychologists follow. And the first one is just do no harm, right? We don't want to hurt people. We don't want to hurt animals. And notice that I keep mentioning both people and animals because when we talk about research participants, they could be either of the two. All of our participants have a right to privacy, as well as informed consent. So at the onset of a study, the participants are provided with information in terms of what they can expect. They know that at any time their participation, because it's voluntary, they could quit the study if they wanted to. And then at the conclusion of the study, we debrief them, which is where basically we provide kind of like a summary of what happened during the research study. If we use deception at all, we will at that point let them know that we did deceive them. But of course, in order to use deception, you'd have to have a really good reason to do that. And again, we always have to go back to number one, which is do no harm. Lastly, there's just a little blurb at the end of the chapter which talks about animals used in research, and I'm looking at my time and I'm right at 30 minutes, so I'm going to stop. I hope that this lecture provided you with at least some basic information to help you get started with your reading in chapter 1. Again, I didn't want to make it too long, but of course, if you have questions, please call me or shoot me an email, stop by my office. I'd be happy to explain any content further. If you have any suggestions, or if you run into any issues, just reach out to me. Thanks so much, and I'll see you for chapter 2.